Hello. So in this video what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking a look at the cruise stage of flight in an Airbus A320 and also look at the top of descent as well. So at the moment we are climbing up towards the cruise, so the first thing we can take a look at is the nav display in front of us. So the first thing we can take a look at is the top of climb. So if we have a look at the nav display here, you'll notice that we've got this blue arrow which kind of angles upwards and then levels off. So this is telling us where our top of climb is, or where we're going to begin our cruise. So you can see by the renderings here it's going to be approximately 15 nautical miles away. Okay, so we're just about 30 seconds away from the top of climb now, so you'll notice that as we get a bit closer, you'll see that the altitude will start to flash. So that's just telling us that we are approaching our assigned altitude there of 35,000 feet, or flight level 350. So as we hit that, you'll see that the aircraft automatically switches into Mach hold mode and also altitude hold mode, so we're not climbing anymore. The aircraft now wants to hold that altitude there. And you can see we just pass over the blue arrow on the nav display there as well. So now that we're in the cruise, what do pilots actually do during the cruise phase of flight? Well, there's a couple of things that pilots will kind of constantly check just to make sure that the plane is doing what is expected. So the first thing, very simply, would be just the primary flight display and the nav display. The pilots will just double check the speeds, the attitudes, the altitudes, just make sure that everything is looking normal there. Check the FMA, make sure that the aircraft is, holding these modes and is active in these modes here as well. Also on the nav display, they'll just be making sure that the plane is following the planned flight path there. And you can also adjust the range now that you're in the cruise to show you as much of the flight path as you would like. Another thing that they'll be checking on the nav display here is for any bad weather. Now, if there is significant weather to worry about, you'll usually notice it as a big kind of green, yellow or red kind of mark on the nav display here. And sometimes you can get away with it and the mark will not pass over your flight path, or your flight path will not pass through the weather. But what happens if it does pass through the weather, if you have a massive cloud right in front of you, for example? Well, normally what pilots would do is they would simply turn the plane away from the clouds to go around it. So to do that, you would simply go to your heading on the FCU here, and then let's say that we want to go right around an imaginary cloud, so we'll set the heading to 360 or 000 there. So we'll just dial that up and then right click to pull the control out, and you see here that the aircraft now goes into heading mode, and it will now follow the heading that you have selected on the FCU here. And you'll notice also on the nav display that the flight path, our planned flight path, has now changed back to a dotted line. So when the aircraft is in managed mode, where the flight computers are guiding the plane, it will be a solid line. When it's in heading mode, where you, the pilots, are controlling the heading, then it'll be dashed out. So normally what you would want to do is you would want to fly away at an angle of maybe 20 to 30 degrees from your kind of planned flight path for a couple of miles. If you have a look at the bottom here, you'll notice that it's giving us our distance away from the planned flight path in nautical miles. So that tells you how far kind of off track you are, so to speak. Now once you're a suitable distance away from the cloud and you're sure that you're going to clear it, what it would then be wise to do is to turn parallel to your assigned flight path there. So let's say that about 4 nautical miles down here we want to kind of follow our planned flight path there. So what I'll do is I'll just wait for that to get to about 3.8 and then turn that back to 340. Slightly over 4 miles there. That's fine. So we're now essentially flying parallel to our planned flight path there. So this, again, this just kind of minimises the distance that we're flying around the cloud. So rather than having a cloud in front of us and going out at an angle and then coming back in at an angle, we kind of fly out as far as we need to, fly parallel, and then fly back into the planned flight path there. So after you turn parallel, after you've gone past the clouds and it's no longer a danger to the aircraft, all you would simply do is just left click the heading button to push the knob into the panel. You see that the heading gets dashed out, the aircraft goes back into nav mode, and it will automatically turn and rejoin the flight path. Some more things that pilots would do is they would periodically just roll through the ECAM pages just to make sure that all of the systems are working normally and there isn't any kind of issues or any inconsistencies arising. So for example, pilots would double check the oil quantity just to make sure that they are relatively even in the real aircraft. They can check the bleed air systems to make sure the temperatures are all even and everything is looking normal there. Now, of course, in an Airbus, if there is any significant problems, the Airbus is smart enough that it will start to alert the pilots. You'll start getting cautions and warnings up on the upper ECAM here. But it's just good practice just to double check and keep an eye on everything manually, just to make sure that it's all running okay there. And one last thing that pilots can also do is they can also keep track of the fuel which is being burned during the flight. So on the flight plan page here, you can see that we've got all of our waypoints and everything. Now you can see what time we're going to hit each waypoint. In this column here it says UTC, so if we have a look at the map very quickly, the next waypoint is going to be Shap. How do we know what time we're going to get there? Well, if we have a look at the flight plan page, you can see we have Shap is the next waypoint there, and it says we're going to get there at 13:02 UTC. So if you have a look at the lower ECAM, you can see that we have the UTC time right in the bottom center of the lower ECAM there as well. So we're going to be at Shap in approximately 2 to 3 minutes time. You can see here that we also have a waypoint which is T/D, so this represents top of descent. So you can see that top of descent is going to be at 13:14, so in about 15 minutes time we're going to be reaching top of descent. It's a very short flight, this one. And then at the bottom you've got EGPE, so that's the runway at Inverness, and that's 13:31, so again that's going to be in about 32 minutes time, 32 minutes time. So that's how you can tell how long it's going to take to reach each waypoint. Now, I started off talking about the fuel burn, so if you want to see how much fuel you should have on board, if you go to either the left or the right arrow, click it once, you'll see that the central column and the right hand column change. So here we have EFOB, which is estimated fuel on board, and you can see how much fuel is going to be estimated to be on board at each waypoint. So at Shap we should have 4.1 tons or 4,100 kilograms of fuel, and then at the next waypoint at Bevy we should have 4 tons or 4,000 kilograms. So as you pass over various waypoints, you don't have to check this for every single waypoint, but it's good practice and it's real world practice just to cross check how much fuel is actually being burned during the flight. So the easiest way to do that is to bring up the fuel page here on the lower ECAM, and then here we have like a white box which says FOB, which is fuel on board. So we have 4,120 kilograms, just as about 4.1 tons there, and as we pass over Shap that should be at 4,100 kilograms. So that's looking like that's going to match up to the estimated fuel usage there. So there is another adjustment that you can do during the cruise. So if we go into the performance page, we can actually increase or decrease the speed that the aircraft is flying at. So you'll notice on this page here we have CI, so that represents our cost index. We can change that during the flight to either speed up or slow down the plane. So if we have a look at the speeds just now, we're travelling at about 270 knots indicated airspeed, or Mach 0.78. Now if I come down, or actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to just pop up the FMC there so we can have a look at the primary flight display. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the cost index from 30 up to say 70, and keep an eye on the airspeed here. What will happen is the airspeed will actually increase because we've told the plane actually we want to burn more fuel and fly more quickly. Remember, the cost index is kind of like a performance number, so if I just type in 70 on the scratch pad and then hit the soft key next to CI, you notice how the speed jumps up there. And if you listen carefully, you should be able to hear the aircraft accelerate to reach that speed. And you see the speed is now increasing up to, for Mach 0.780, is going to be up to 0.79 something, I would imagine. And of course, now that we're flying quicker, we're going to pass over the waypoints, so we're going to arrive at our various waypoints a bit quicker. And we can also do that in the opposite direction. So we've got the cost index of 70. If we want to return that back to 30, we just type in 30 there, hit the soft key, and if you notice again, the speed now drops, and you'll hear the aircraft decelerate to get back to that speed, or the ideal speed for that cost index number there. So I believe it's the real world practice is to do those checks maybe every half an hour, just to scan all of the systems, make sure everything is going okay there. Apart from that, in the real world, pilots don't really do much during the cruise. Usually they just talk about their company airline, they talk about new procedures, new aircraft which might be being purchased by the airline. They just talk about things that people would normally talk about, sports, family and all the rest of it. So yes, there's nothing really to do during the cruise apart from periodic checks on the plane and chatting with your co-pilot. So for this video, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to skip ahead until we get a bit closer to the top of descent, because there's a couple of things that we need to do before we start the descent. Okay, so we're getting a bit further along our flight here. So remember when we hit the top of the climb or the start of the cruise, we had an arrow, a blue arrow, which kind of came up at an angle and then leveled off. We see now that we have a white arrow which starts off level and then starts to go down at a downward angle. So this is a visual representation of the top of descent. So you can see that we've got this TLA waypoint, slight turn, and then we'll begin our top of descent in about 60 nautical miles. So there's a couple of things that you want to do before you reach this top of descent point, and that is setting up the CDU with some approach information. So if you go to the performance page and then hit the next phase button a couple of times until you reach the approach page here, what we need to do is we need to enter in a little bit of information about our destination. So the reason we need to do this is because the flight computers need to calculate the sort of the weather conditions at our destination, and that helps us to figure out the landing configuration for the aircraft and sort of performance for the aircraft there. So the first thing we need is to get a weather report at our destination airport and then enter in the information. So the information that you will need is the QNH, the temperature at the airports, the wind direction and wind speed, the transition altitude for your arrival airports, and also the barometric minimum height or the decision height, or you can do it by using the radio altimeter. So I'm not sure of the exact weather conditions at Inverness Airport because I'm using the fair weather standard preset weather. So I'm just going to estimate some of these, but the QNH will be 1013, which is the standard barometric pressure. So you'll notice that the QNH in the Airbus is measured in millibars and not inches of mercury. So you'll need to enter it as millibars there, or hectopascals. The temperature, again, I'm not sure what that will be. I think it's about 14 degrees Celsius. Again, the temperature is in Celsius and not Fahrenheit. Winds will be 0 degrees at 0 knots because it's fair weather, there's no winds at all. I know just from personal experience the transition altitude at Inverness is 4,000 feet. Normally you'll find the transition altitude information on the star or the approach charts for your arrival airports, so just put that in there. And then the minimums, I'm not sure what the minimums are at Inverness, but normally again on the ILS approach chart for the specific runway that you're landing on, it will give you the barometric minimums there. As a kind of a rough or a safe estimate, if you're not sure how to read charts or you're not sure what the barometric minimum heights will be, a good altitude would be about 250 feet above ground level. So if you put 250 feet in the radio box there, again that's just a rough estimate, that's a good general estimate there. So you'll notice that once you've entered all that information in, you get your V approach speed. So this is going to be your final speed as you approach the runway, so make a note of that. And then you've got your VLS or your V landing speed there of 130. But the main speed that you want to make a note of here is your approach speed, which will be 135. Now what you can also do on this page is you could also choose between a flaps 3 landing or a flaps 4 landing. So here you see we've got a heading which says landing config. So at the moment you've got full in capitals, so that means that when you land you intend to use the flaps 4 setting or the full flaps setting for landing. Now in the event that there's strong crosswinds, you might want to go for a flaps 3 config, because the flaps are going to provide a bit less wind resistance, but in like heavy turbulence or heavy winds, that's actually better for the plane because strong gusts of winds won't push the plane around as much. So if you want to use a flaps 3 landing config, you just hit the soft key next to that and you see that it goes into capitals. Now the side effect of using less flaps for landing is that the approach speeds will be slightly higher. So you can choose a flaps 3 landing there if you wish, or you can do a full landing there. Now one other thing to note, if you are going to use a flaps 3 landing, you will need to adjust or push a button on the upper overhead. So there's a landing flap 3 button here, so if you do decide that you want to use a flaps 3 landing procedure, you will also need to enable that button there. Don't ask me what it does because I don't know, I'm afraid, but I do know that you just need to have that enabled for the landing if you choose to do a flaps 3 landing. But for Inverness we're going to do a full flaps landing, so I'll leave that switched off. Double check that, make sure full is in capitals, yep, and that's all good there. So now that we're getting a bit closer to our top of descent marker, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to just bring the range down slightly. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start the descent. I'm going to manually start the descent about 5 nautical miles before we reach the marker. So the reason we do this is because we could let the plane reach the top of descent marker and then dial the altitude down, and then the plane will pretty much just drop down into a steep dive immediately. However, if you start the descent early, what will happen is the plane will kind of drop into a gentle 1,000 feet per minute descent, and then when it intercepts the vertical path for the descent, it will then descend at a much faster rate. You'll see what I mean when I do it. So for the descent, what you want to do is you want to set the altitude to your last altitude. For me, to make it easier, what I do is I set the altitudes that I'm going to be intercepting the glide slope at. So in the case of Inverness Airport, we're going to be intercepting the glide slope at 2,000 feet. What I'll do is I'll put the approach chart on the screen just now so you can see there that what we do is we descend down to 2,000 feet, we have a level turn at 2,000 feet, and then we intercept the glide slope. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dial down the altitude to 2,000 feet in a few moments. Okay, so we're getting pretty close to about 5 nautical miles there. So what I'm going to do is roll the altitude down to 2,000 feet, and then left click on it to push it in, and you see we get the little ball gets enabled. Now keep an eye on the FMA. You want to make sure that descent mode is enabled, and you'll notice here that the aircraft is now in a 1,000 feet descent, 1,000 feet per minute descent there. You'll also notice a couple of new icons on your primary flight display. So you'll see that we have a couple of magenta lines. So what will happen is the aircraft will automatically try to keep within this kind of range of speed here. You'll also notice on the right hand side that we now have a little magenta dot, a little pink dot here. So this works very much like a glide slope indicator, except it's for the full descent from the cruise down to the approach phase of flight. So as we get closer to our ideal vertical descent path, this dot will start to move down towards the center here, and then just as it hits the sort of center line here, you'll notice that the aircraft will start to descend, and will start to descend at a much faster rate. So just wait for that to come down, and you see that the aircraft automatically pitches downwards, and it's going to try and hold that pink dot in the center there. Now generally when this happens, you'll notice that we get thrust gets reverted to idle there as well. And you see now that we are descending at 2,400 feet per minute. Now on occasion what might happen is the plane might be, if the plane is heavy, if you're flying the larger variants of the A320 such as the A321, what might happen is the aircraft might speed up too much and it might struggle to stay within the speed range. A result of that is that you end up going above your ideal flight path, and if that happens you might see a message here in the top center of the primary flight display which says drag required or drag needed. So if you see that message, all you would need to do is just go down to your speed brakes here and just extend them all of the way like that. What will happen is the flight computers will only extend them halfway automatically, and that will both slow the plane down and increase the rate of descent there. Another way to check your vertical deviation here, to check how you're performing relative to the ideal rate of descent, is if you go to the program page, you'll see that it automatically switches to descent. Here we have a kind of a line here which says vertical deviation, and you can see that it's at minus 17 feet, so we're ever so slightly below our ideal path of descent. Basically the plane is going to try to keep this as near zero as possible, and the numbers will fluctuate, so that is to be expected, but ideally you want that to be at 0 feet. If it's at 0 feet, that means you're bang on your vertical descent path. And of course, as a pilot, you just want to keep an eye on the nav display as well, just to make sure that the plane is still following the planned lateral flight path as well. So now that we're in the descent, there's a few sort of checklist items that we need to start looking at. So you want to just double check the seatbelt signs, make sure they're set to auto, because when we pass through 10,000 feet there's going to be a few steps that we need to do, but just double check just now just to make sure that's set to auto in case you forget it as slightly later on. You want to make sure that the anti-ice is switched off at this point, and you also want to double check the barometric reference, make sure that is still on standard. That's all good for now. So the next few steps that we need to take are going to be at 10,000 feet, so I'm going to just cut the video again just until we reach about 10,000 feet there. Okay, so we've just passed through 11,000 feet, and you'll notice that the aircraft will kind of pitch up slightly at this point. So the reason it does that is because at 10,000 feet there's a sort of a blanket speed restriction of 250 knots. So the easiest way for the aircraft to bleed off speed without requiring the use of the spoilers or any sort of input from the engines is just to level off, and you'll see that the speed will drop to about 250 knots, and then as the speed drops, then the aircraft will slowly nose down to pick up the rate of descent again. So you can see that the managed speed there is now at 250. You can see we've got the two magenta lines as well, giving us a bit of a speed range there of about 255 knots down to 230. And if you have a look on the right hand side, you can see that we're still tracking that magenta or that pink dot pretty much bang on there, so that's all good. So now that we've just passed through 10,000 feet, there's a couple more actions that we need to do. First would be to turn on the seatbelt signs. So those go on, and they'll stay on now for the rest of the flight. The landing lights can now come on as well, so flick those into the on position. And then the last thing to switch on is the landing system. So that's just the small button next to the flight director here, so turn that on, and you'll notice that we get some dots around our primary flight display, which represent our glide slope and our localizer. And these have again pink or magenta diamonds to track those. So you can see at the moment we're way above our glide slope and we're way to the right side of that, but obviously we're approaching from a funny angle there. You'll also notice in the bottom right hand corner that we have the ILN, so the ILS information is automatically dialed in the bottom left corner there, so that just confirms that you are tuned into the correct ILS system. And that is all I'm going to cover in this video. So in the next video we're going to be looking at the approach, final and landing procedures, and we'll probably also do cleanup and parking as well in the next video. So the next video is going to be very busy, but yeah, it's going to be too much if I include it in this one. So yeah, so I'm going to wrap up this video. So first of all, I just want to say a massive thank you as always to my Patreon supporters. You know, as I've said before, you know, the significance of your donations isn't lost on me, so thank you very much for that. And thank you everyone else for watching. So until the next time, take care out there, and I will catch you all later.